So last week we started a new sermon series on prayer, and we set up right from the beginning that this is not going to be a sermon series where we look so much at the functionality of prayer as far as this is what you do and stuff like that, and we're not going to come out of it with this grand understanding of prayer as much as we are going to look at different prayers in Scripture that were offered by different people in different circumstances. And what was the circumstance? What was the emotion? What was the frustration? How did they go to God? And then how did God respond? And so last week we started with Jesus in the garden praying to his Father, can this cup please pass from me, Father? But then he said the most important thing. He said, not my will, but your will be done. And he had a submissive heart in his struggle. He had a submissive heart to God. And the interesting thing about that is that God's answer to his own son was silence. And that's difficult for us. We struggle with that when we hear silence in our prayers. But I want us, and I think it's important that we adopt this mentality of a not my will, but your will be done. And to do this, we have to be submitted to the idea that God's way is better than our way. Practicing this kind of prayer is difficult, especially when God answers our prayer for our will, and his will isn't the same as our will. But his way is better. So are we humble enough to accept that? And this kind of prayer is difficult, but it's a worshipful way of praying. And that was kind of a summary of last week. Now, before we jump into this week, I kind of need to set up the scenario at which this prayer was coming into. But I want to talk to it from where we're sitting right now first. I started last week's sermon with a bit of a humorous look at how we as people can get anxious about things. And I presented to you about my senior paper in college that I was anxious about preparing. I was anxious about delivering in front of people. I just wasn't looking forward to it. Now, I wrote that paper back in the early 2000s on postmodernism in the church. That was the topic that I was given. And my thesis in its simplest form was that postmodernism is how our society is thinking, so the church will need to find ways to exist within that culture. Now, I won't go into the details of that necessarily. It probably wasn't a very good paper, but there was truth within it. The postmodern mindset is prevalent in every aspect of our society. It really is. And it's a philosophy that is not easily defined, but the philosophy kind of flows through every area of our culture and our way of thinking, from art to conversation to thinking to beliefs. One of the prevailing arguments of the postmodern mindset is the rejection of universal truth. Postmodernism rejects universal truth, instead relying on individual truth and the almighty experience. My experience, therefore, dictates what is true. Experience plays a huge role in postmodern thinking. Now, I'm not going to go into extreme details here. This can get quite philosophical and, frankly, boring. And trust me when I say you can go down a big rabbit hole when you start researching this stuff. And with that said, this mindset that we currently have in our world is on display in nearly every aspect of life. Postmodernism is alive and well, and Satan is using it. Especially when it comes to the idea of experience over universal truth. As a society, we love personal experience. Our experience is, in many ways, more important than anything else. Let me give you an example. It's just a short one. If a person walks into a church and doesn't like the music, then they draw a conclusion about that church: it's not for me. Maybe it was too loud, maybe it was too new, maybe it was too old, or maybe it was too slow or too fast or whatever. The purpose, though, of music is to glorify God, to reinforce spiritual and scriptural truths about God, and to help grow our faith in him. So why does our experience with music matter? It's just a question. I'm not saying it's not important. It's just a question. But what I want us to ponder our motives. Is the music about us or is it about God? See, our postmodern, experience-driven mindset often elevates our feelings and emotions and experience over what the music was intended for, the glorification of God. So did the music glorify God? That's the question that would be a better question. Now, I could go on a whole tirade about that subject. I'm just using it as an example, and so don't run with it too much. But postmodernism, in many ways, attempts to change our relationship with God from a submissive, He is God, so I will worship Him approach into a transactional relationship. I will then worship God, but I now want something out of it. A plus B equals C, right? Right? Okay. I am seeking God, and He answered my prayer, therefore God is real. Or, I have a spiritual experience and a personal affirmation, therefore God is real, right? Right, okay. But let's think about that. Because there's a dangerous second side to that theory. I am seeking God. He did not answer my prayer. Therefore, God is not real. You see where I'm going with this? I am seeking God and I have no spiritual experience or personal affirmation. Therefore, God is not real. That's the dangerous side of this. And to most who subscribe to the postmodern way of thinking, either wholeheartedly or without realizing that that is the lens through which they are making their decisions, either way, they would say my experience should matter in the way that I construct my life. And that's great. But what if your experience isn't truth? What if your experiences lied to you and trusting in them blindly took you away from God? What if even though you prayed for it, God did not give you the proof you so eagerly desired? Your experiences can lie to you. If God is God, then He is God even if your experiences told you He wasn't. That's the thing. That's why it's such a dangerous thought process. Okay, that's a lot. Why is he going off on postmodernism and relative truth, right? Well, I think that can be answered up in Judges chapter 21, verse 15. It says this: in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In those days, in the days of the judges, Israel was a mess. Was a mess. Moses had long since passed, Joshua had too, and the people of Israel were consistently seeking worldliness and passions of pagan worship. They were easily led away from God, and He would rise up a judge to bring them back to the worship of Yahweh. In many ways, the days of the judges were similar to today's way of thinking. Experience and personal truth was absolutely a distraction from the purposeful worship of God. We're in that same thing. In fact, there's a lot of studies on this, that time period, the thinking was very similar. Everything goes in cycles, right? Everything was very similar to the way we think today. That was one of the many reasons that the worship of these other gods was so appealing to the people of Israel. It was experience-oriented. Instead of solemnly showing respect for God and performing sacrifices to atone for their sins, Israel was drawn to the pagan worship of other gods that was much more exciting, it was much more enticing, it was much more full of passion. Their experience when worshiping these other gods felt good. It was addictive. The people of Israel were not in a good place spiritually. Even the priesthood was in shambles. In the book of 1 Samuel, where we're going to be hanging out today, Eli is the priest, and his sons Hophni and Phinehas served alongside of him in Shiloh. To put it bluntly, these men were not spiritual leaders. They weren't. Chapters 2 and 3 of 1 Samuel will depict their lack of spiritual leadership, and God will put an end to the family because of their faithless leadership. It's in this backdrop that we meet a few very important people: Elkanah, Hannah, and Samuel. What I love about this family is that there's nothing special about them. They were not a powerful family. They weren't leaders. They were simple people, simple Israelites who humbly served God at a time when most of Israel was off doing whatever felt good, whatever seemed right in their own eyes. This family was faithful. Elkanah was a simple man who faithfully served the Lord. Every year he would go to Shiloh to worship and serve sacrifices to the Lord. He would take his family with him, as was quite common in those days. He had 2 wives. More than likely, this was because Hannah was barren. And to carry on the family name, he needed to have for that family to carry on land rights, a man had to produce a male offspring. With Hannah barren, he took on a second wife to produce the children. His second wife, Peninnah, I can never say that name right, whatever. Peninnah would hold this fact over Hannah and torment her for her inability to produce offspring. And this was more than a source of irritation to Hannah. In that culture, if you couldn't reproduce, you were considered worthless by most. Furthermore, it was likely in a cultural stigma that they considered her a sinner that God was punishing by not being able to have kids. And so she was viewed as not valuable and a sinner. So when Peninnah would provoke her and torment her over her lack of offspring, it would demoralize Hannah. However, Elkanah loved Hannah. When he would take them for their yearly pilgrimage to Shiloh, Elkanah would give her a double portion of meat to Hannah to show her his love. But Hannah was so distraught she wouldn't eat. She would just weep in sorrow. And that's where we pick up today. With all that thinking in line, that's where we pick up today. 1 Samuel chapter 1, we're going to read verses 8 through 20. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, "Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, "O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head." As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, "How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you." But Hannah answered, "No, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I've drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation." Then Eli answered, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your eyes." Then the woman went on her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. They rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son. And she called his name Samuel, for she said, "I have asked for him from the Lord." The place we kind of need to start, let's just get it out of the way, is Elkanah's response to Hannah. "Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" Guys, how would that go over today if you said that to your wife? Next time your wife is struggling with something, I want you to tell her, don't worry about it, honey. You have me for a husband. That'll go over really well, won't it? In all seriousness, Elkanah was telling his wife that he loved her, even if she didn't have children. In that world, a woman's value was her childbearing, her offspring. So because God had closed Hannah's womb, she felt like she had no value. She felt worthless. Elkanah was showing her that he viewed her as valuable, even when the world told her she had no value. Even though his response is a little out there, he is showing her he valued her. He is showing her the way God valued her too. Her value wasn't in childbearing. Her value was in her worship of God, even in hardship. And to Elkanah, her value was that she was his wife, and he loved her. Many men in that day wouldn't have shown her that same kind of love. So even if we poke fun at his response a little bit, it's worth pointing out that Elkanah was a good man. However, her sorrow was real. Peninnah had made her life miserable. Hannah, after years of dealing with this sorrow, had grown deeply distressed. So after not eating, she takes her sorrow and gives it to the Lord. She decides to be real with God. And so she prayed and wept before God. Have you ever wept before God? Yeah. Have you ever struggled to find the words to express the deepness of your emotion when you go to God? Yeah. As much as sorrow and distress are emotions that we avoid as best we can, they are important emotions for us to work through. And when in those moments, or maybe those moments are days or weeks or months or years, those moments that last forever of sorrow, when in those moments we turn to God and are able to humble ourselves in a beautiful way and show that humility before God, it sets the stage for God to do what only He can do. Sorrow and distress need to be given to God, sometimes more than once. I don't think that this was the first time that Hannah had prayed about this situation. I think this had been an issue for years. I think it was probable that she deeply despised this pilgrimage to Shiloh. It was the pinnacle of her sorrow. It was the twisting of the knife. And Peninnah knew how to twist the knife. And Satan does the same thing to us. He twists that knife and unfortunately makes us despise the one who would actually be able to help us. Hannah wasn't looking forward to worshiping God at Shiloh. But in her sorrow, she turned to God anyways, year after year, bearing her soul to her Father in heaven, and her Father heard her. God had a plan. Don't miss it. God had a plan in all of this. He was going to use this simple family. Elkanah, Hannah, were going to change the course of history for Israel. And I believe He chose them because they were simply a faithful family in a time when Israel wasn't faithful. They were willing to be faithful. They were willing to continue to worship God and submit themselves to Him. In a time when everyone else did what they wanted, this family was faithful. And so God was going to hear Hannah's prayer and open Hannah's womb, and a child would be born who would lead Israel back to God. Isn't it interesting how God continuously gets Israel's attention through the birth of a child? Constantly. Abraham and Sarah were barren and old, too old. God gave them Isaac. Moses was born and saved from the child slaughter of the Hebrews, and he would lead Israel. Israel had turned away from God for generations. Barren Hannah gives birth to Samuel, who would lead the people of Israel at a very important time. Years later, Mary would be found faithful and deliver the Savior Jesus, another child, this time the child who would deliver everyone from their sins. Now, I know I jumped ahead in the story a little bit, but God uses children so many times. God was listening to Hannah because she was faithful to Him. Let's look at what she said, and it was quite simple. In verse 11, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. A few things I want to point out about this very simple prayer. In her sorrow, she begins by acknowledging God's proper place. She wasn't blaming God. She wasn't even questioning him. She was calling him Lord. She was calling him Lord. She was humbly approaching the God of heaven. And I believe she did this because she feared him. Not a scared kind of fear, a respectful fear. Another thing that stands out to me is the phrase, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant. She is asking God to look at her. She's saying, God, see me. Hannah knows that God is the Lord of hosts. She knows that she isn't a priest or a leader. She's a barren woman, but she wants God to see her, to look upon her, to witness her pain. She knows he's busy with all sorts of other things, but she says, look on me, God, please, just look at me. I think we can ask God to look at us, witness her pain. This statement is tied to her address of God, though. O Lord of hosts, look on me, your servant. This represents a healthy fear of God. Psalm 103, 11 through 14, for as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his steadfast love towards those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to his children. For he knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. Hannah approaches God with a healthy respect, which is fear, and a humble acknowledgement that she has no right to even ask him to look on her. But in her sorrow, she asks anyway. She calls herself a servant 3 times. Did you catch that? If you will look on the affliction of your servant, don't forget your servant, but give to your servant. These aren't just empty words. This is a declaration. She is saying over and over again, I am yours. I will serve you. I will be your servant. And while she is preparing to ask her master, in no way is she questioning her commitment to God. She doesn't say, if you do this, then I'll do this, but if you don't, I won't. That would be an ultimatum, and she doesn't do that. She says, I'm your servant. She does ask of him, and she does say, I will do something in return, but she doesn't do it in an ultimatum form where if God doesn't answer her prayer the way she thinks he needs to answer it, that she won't serve him. No, she's his servant, no matter what. And then she makes her request. Give to me a son, and I will give him back to you in service of you. Notice that what she got for that in return, she gave back in service. She did it. She followed through. A child that she had longed for, a child would give her everything she had been missing, and she was going to give it back to God. She wouldn't see him grow up. She wouldn't be a part of his life. He would be in Shiloh and she would be back home. She would give him back to God. Isn't that the purpose of raising children? God gives us the gift of children. It's our responsibility as parents to give those children back to God, to be his servants. Are we dedicated to that? So that's her prayer. And she prayed it in sorrow and in pain, and Eli the priest was so out of touch with God that he thought her prayer of sorrow was a drunken stupor. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on Eli and his sons. If you read the rest of chapters 2 and 3, you'll understand that they did a poor job of leading. And they were so distant from God that they couldn't even understand what true humility before God looked like. But once Hannah explained herself, Eli understood. And he agrees with her. And he says, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him." And I believe those were Eli's finest moments. By saying this, the priest who was in charge of an entire region of people before God, this priest is saying to God, "Do this. I'm in agreement with it. Let it be done." Now, we live in a time, this is tricky, okay? We live in a time where the curtain has been torn, okay? God is available to us all. We can pray in the Spirit to God whenever, and he hears us. But because Jesus is the high priest and advocates for us, we can approach the throne of God. And Hebrews tells us approach it with boldness. In the time of Hannah, a priest was how you went to God. So she could pray, and God would hear. Don't get me wrong. They could still pray. But a priest was how you went to God. So when the priest says, "Let the God of Israel grant your petition," it meant something. God was still the ultimate decider, but the priest advocating meant something. And I don't have that same power as your senior minister, okay? I can agree with your prayers all I want, but I'm not a priest. Hannah leaves that interaction with a newfound confidence. She gave her struggle to God, and God didn't answer her right then and there. She had no clue if he would. She left no longer sad, though. The struggle she had, the sorrow that she felt that had driven her to what she called anxiety and vexation, that same struggle she turned over to God and she gave it up. Whether or not God would answer her in the way she wanted no longer mattered. She had given it to God. What do you need to give to God? What are you holding on to that you need to give to God? Lay it out there. He's listening. Ask him to look upon you in your struggle and give that struggle to God. The Lord of hosts hears you. Ask him to see you. Declare yourself his servant no matter what, and ask God for deliverance from the struggle, and then be the servant you declared yourself to be, not just empty words. Hannah said, "I'm your servant. Give me a son and I will return him to you," and she did it. She did it. She walked away not knowing if God would give her a son, but in time she became pregnant for the first time. And can you imagine the joy that went through her as she started to first realize, "I think I might be pregnant"? Can you imagine the joy that went through her as that child grew in her womb? Then she gives birth and she feels vindicated. Then she nurses the child until he's most likely around 3 years old. That's the prevailing thought is Samuel was around 3 or so, maybe a little older. And she returns to Shiloh with the child and presents him to Eli. Samuel was given back to God in complete servanthood. And you know that little tagline at the end, it says, "And a razor will not cut his head." That's because she had put him in a Nazirite vow for life. And so he was not going to cut his hair as an amount of respect for God. He was going to serve him no matter what. There's a lot to the Nazirite vow. I'm not going to get into it. She was a woman of her word. She didn't go back from what she said. She bore her soul to God and followed through on what she said she would do. Samuel grew up to be an incredible servant himself. He was used by God in a powerful way to bring the people back to God. He's vital to the kingdom of Israel through the kingships of Saul and part of David. He leads completely differently than Eli did. In fact, chapters 2 and 3 basically contrast Samuel and the sons of Eli, showing that in every way they weren't, Samuel was. None of this is possible if Hannah isn't faithful. I love the example of Elkanah and Hannah. I love how she approaches God. She approaches him in the pit of her struggle. She says, "You are my God. Please see your servant. Let me honor you." And after giving Samuel back to God, she prays again. This time it's a prayer of joy. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. My heart exalts in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There's none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and rises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap, to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness, for not by might shall man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Hannah's sorrow was turned into joy. Notice how her prayer has nothing to do with her. She's simply praying about the goodness of a God who looks out for his faithful people. It's all about God. Her prayer is all about how he works in the world, how he makes things right, how he is all powerful and worthy of praise. It shows how man is simple and unimpressive and sinful. But the Lord does good things despite man's arrogance and ignorance. He and he alone can accomplish these wonders. So here's where we're at. In last week's prayer, Jesus approached God and asked him for something, but submitted to God and said, "Not my will, but yours be done." This week, Hannah approaches God and also asks him for something. But she had the same servant's heart as Jesus did. In asking God for the child, she was also giving God her sorrow and saying, "I don't want this anymore. I am your servant. Do with me what you will." Hannah's sorrow turned to joy. But the reason her sorrow turned to joy isn't because God answered her prayer. It was because she chose to serve him. She had already left the sorrow at the feet of God before she knew he was going to answer that prayer. She left that prayer and went back and ate and was no longer sad. Months later, she became pregnant. And then her joy was complete. There's a lot we could gain from this. There's a lot we can learn from this. I want to end in this way. I'm going to pose to you 4 questions. And I want you to think about these questions this week. As you go through your days, think about these questions that we can ponder from what we've learned today. Number 1, are you living faithfully in a time when everyone else is doing whatever seems good to them? Are you living faithfully in a time when everyone else is doing what seems good to them? That's question number 1. Question number 2, are you being real with God, expressing your sorrow, your frustration, and leaving it with God? Are you being real with God, expressing your sorrow and frustration, and then leaving it with God? Question number 3, I'm sorry for those of you who are writing these down. I should have put them on the screen. Number 3, are you willing to serve God even if you have to give up what you want the most? Number 3, are you willing to serve God even if you have to give up what you want the most? Number 4, Are you expressing the glory of God when you pray to him in joy? Number 4, are you expressing the glory of God when you pray to him in joy?